So I'm out here at the Alamo Draft House, which is where I would be spending many, many hours if it was open, but it's not. So we figured we'd come on out and get a little fresh air and maybe touch the wall of a place that is very important to us. So I'm watching a lot of things on streaming, as I'm sure you are right now. And one of the things I happened upon on Amazon Prime, which is free if you have Amazon Prime, is a documentary from just a handful of years ago called Shut Up, Little Man, which is a documentary about, so you know the Jerky Boys, and you know viral audio tapes, found audio recordings, things like that. This was one of those that was sort of big in the late 80s into the 90s. I remember hearing about it when I was in college at the time, and it was this series of recordings that these two young guys, they moved to San Francisco, they got their first apartment, and they found on the other side of the wall were these two elderly drunken men who would just scream at each other all night long. They would basically drink all day and then scream at each other all night long. And it drove these two young guys crazy, and they started making recordings of these arguments, maybe partly as evidence if anything bad happened, and partly to amuse themselves and their friends and try to just not go insane from all this arguing all the time. One thing led to another. These audio recordings started getting traded and passed out to friends and friends of friends, and a viral audio comedy voyeurism phenomenon began. So this documentary, these are tapes that I heard in college. Recently, I heard them again. They're all on Spotify, like hours and hours of this stuff. And the audio recordings are interesting. They are amusing. There are repeated phrases. These guys scream at each other. They're occasionally clever. It's occasionally sad and disturbing. I mean, it's two people who are basically alcoholics just arguing all the time. To me, listening to them at first was amusing and interesting and ultimately just repetitive and depressing, but they're out there if you want to hear them. So this documentary basically tells the story of how these things came to be. It tells the story of the two young guys, how that whole experience went, and then what to me was even more interesting than where these recordings came from was the story of what happened after the recordings started leaking out. They became popular, they became a sensation, traded, talked about. Comic books, plays, films were going to be attempted to be made about this phenomenon, and this just tells you how those two guys went through all that and ultimately tried to find out who these men next door who gave them a little fame and not much fortune, who these guys really were and where their lives went. I thought it was fascinating, it was funny, it was sad, very well put together, really clever use of vintage stills and stock footage at times to sort of tell this story. I don't know how fascinating this is if you haven't heard of these recordings. This was something that a friend of mine in college was really into and gave me, so it was kind of interesting to hear the truth behind all of the myth over the years. If you've never heard the recordings, they play a lot of them, you get a good sense of who these guys are, so it's probably still interesting, but I think it's far more interesting if you've heard the tapes before. This is something that's it's about an hour and a half, very well done, loaded with profanity and surprisingly some gore, which I didn't expect, and it's available on Amazon Prime now if you're interested for you to check out.